A few years ago, I moved to a new city and rented an old apartment building on the outskirts. The rent was cheap and it was quiet. The only downside was how empty it felt. Most of the building's rooms were unoccupied, and the hallways were so silent it was almost eerie. The very first night after moving in, just as I was about to fall asleep, my phone suddenly rang. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was close to midnight. I hesitated but answered. There was only silence on the other end. I asked, "Hello? Who's there?" But there was no response, only the sound of faint breathing. I assumed it was a prank and hung up. But the strange part was that every night at midnight, the phone would ring again. Each time when I answered, there was the same silence and soft breathing. I became restless and distracted. Even at work, I felt as though someone was watching me from a distance. Eventually, my friend suggested I ignore it, reasoning it was likely just someone playing a cruel prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, especially as the sense of being watched grew stronger each day. Finally, one night, when the phone rang again at midnight, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I picked it up, almost yelling into the phone, ready to shout, but before I could say anything, a low voice slowly came from the other end. "Do you like your new home?" I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The voice knew I had just moved in. That night, I couldn't sleep, my mind consumed by a strange, creeping dread. I checked every lock and window, making sure everything was secure, though I knew it wouldn't make much difference. From then on, every midnight, the phone would ring again. Sometimes it was silence. Other times I'd hear cold whispers. Then, one night, the voice asked, "Do you know what's under your bed?" I froze, staring at the darkness beneath my bed. I fought the urge to imagine what might be lurking there. "Why don't you take a look?" the voice taunted. With trembling hands, I took my phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly crouching to peer under the bed. There was nothing, just a few dust bunnies. I sighed in relief, though my heart was still racing. Just then, a new message appeared on my phone screen. "Look in the mirror." I turned slowly toward the mirror in the corner of the room. At first, all I saw was my own pale, exhausted reflection. But as I stared longer, another face began to appear. A pale girl, her lips curled into a strange, eerie smile, her eyes fixed right on me. Slowly, she lifted a hand in the mirror and pointed to the bed I had just checked. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone, but I could still feel her presence lingering, watching me from somewhere nearby. I was consumed with fear. The next day, I moved out of the apartment without looking back. But even after I left, the phone calls continued to haunt me, no matter where I went. Every night at midnight, the phone would ring, and I'd hear that familiar breathing or a faint, unsettling laugh, as if she were still watching me.
That night, I had just returned home from a late shift at work. The streets were empty, the moonlight streamed through the curtains, and the room was eerily quiet. After taking a shower, I sat down on the couch and suddenly heard a faint knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up and peered through the peephole, but there was nothing outside. That strange feeling made me uneasy, but I convinced myself it was just the wind blowing against the neighbor's door that I picked up my phone, intending to continue working. Suddenly, the time on my screen flickered. It had been 10:47, but then it changed to 11:19. I stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a chill run down my spine. I glanced back at the door, confirming no one was there, and finally relaxed. Just as I was about to refocus on my work, the knocking returned, this time louder and more insistent. I stood up, my heartbeat quickening. I walked cautiously to the door and placed my hand on the doorknob, hesitating for a few seconds. Through the peephole, I saw nothing. My hand trembled as I stood there, unable to move. Before I could even react, I heard a low whispering voice, as though it was coming from just outside the door. I strained to listen, the voice becoming clearer. "Help me." My heart raced. I could feel my breath quicken. I shakily called out, "Who's there?" There was no answer, only the voice growing louder, more desperate. "Help me, don't close the door." I hesitated for a moment, then quickly opened the door, but saw nothing. I stood in the doorway, scanning the area, but the street was empty. As I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, a series of words appeared on the ground, right at my feet. "Help me," written in a strange, jagged script that sent shivers down my spine. It looked as if it had been scratched into the ground with something sharp. A cold dread washed over me, my back prickling. I prepared to close the door, but before I could, an icy hand reached in from the darkness, gripping my wrist with an iron-like force. I tried to pull away, but the hand was freezing, like ice, and I couldn't move. I screamed, but no one came. That hand seemed to grow stronger, pulling me toward the darkness outside. I struggled with all my might, but it felt like my body was being dragged further into the unknown. Suddenly, all strength left me. The hand vanished, and I lost my balance, crashing to the ground. The world around me blurred, and I felt as if I had never experienced such terror before. I heard the wind outside, soft and quiet, as though nothing had happened. I was still lying in the spot where the moonlight bathed the room in its eerie glow. When I finally got to my feet, I noticed something. The words on the ground were gone, as though they'd never been there. I turned to look at the room behind me, feeling lost and confused. What had happened? It was as if everything had returned to normal. But then, just as I turned to leave, I heard that voice again, whispering in my ear, "You haven't left. I've always been here." I felt cold all over, my heart pounding irregularly. That whispering voice was no longer just in my ears, it was in my mind, growing clearer, suffocating me with its presence. I slowly stood up, scanning my surroundings. Nothing had changed. The room was silent. But then, my eyes were drawn to the television screen. It was off, but then it flickered for a moment. I blinked, unsure if I had imagined it. The screen began to show some distorted images, static at first, but soon they cleared up. It was the image of my own living room. Even the way I was sitting on the couch was reflected on the screen. I froze, my breath catching. In the image on the screen, I saw myself slowly look up. But it wasn't me. The eyes in the reflection were hollow and filled with an unsettling emptiness. It wasn't my face, there was only cold, silent dread where my expression should have been. I tried to turn off the TV, but before I could, the screen went dark and then flickered again. The words, "Help me," appeared on the screen, written in crooked, blood-red letters that oozed a disturbing, otherworldly aura. Just then, the television emitted a screeching noise, like something was being violently torn. My head began to spin, and the room felt suffocating. The air seemed to thicken, and my chest tightened. That voice returned in my mind, clear and cold. "You can't leave." I desperately slammed my phone against my ear and tried to call for help, but nothing happened. My body felt paralyzed, as if an invisible force had me bound. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was my father. I nearly dropped the phone, trembling as I answered, "Dad, what's wrong?" "Son, don't look back, don't come home." My blood ran cold, and I stammered, "What do you mean?" "I'm here." "What's happening?" "You're still at home. You need to leave, now." His voice was filled with panic. "That's not you in there. There's someone else." At that moment, the TV flickered once more, and the screen shifted. I saw the corner of the living room. There, in the shadows, was a figure, its back bent unnaturally, its eyes hollow and devoid of life. The figure was slowly walking toward me, step by step, its movements jerky and distorted. I could feel the air around me become colder, heavier. My heart raced. It felt like that thing, was closing in on me. My phone fell from my hand, my body frozen with fear. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body refused to respond. The figure grew closer, its steps echoing in my mind. It raised its hand toward me, its fingers twisted and unnatural. "You can't escape," the voice echoed in my mind, louder now, suffocating that I could feel its cold presence wrap around me, as though it was pulling me into the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. Suddenly, everything went dark. The last thing I heard was that voice, cold and relentless. "You are mine now." I still can't shake the memory of that night, as much as I want to. It was supposed to be a simple weekend drive with my friends, but we ended up somewhere we never should have been. The trouble started when our GPS went haywire. A dense fog rolled in, shrouding the narrow road in a gray mist so thick we could hardly see a few feet ahead. That's when we noticed a small wooden sign barely visible by the roadside. Faded letters spelled out Willowbrook Village. None of us had ever heard of it, but with no other options, we decided to follow the road in. The village was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the occasional creak of a distant branch, swaying gently in the wind. Everything seemed abandoned. There were no lights, no people. Just rows of old wooden houses with dark, empty windows staring down at us like hollow eyes. As we walked further in, I started noticing strange little details. Each house had a sign by the door, carved with a single name and a date. The dates were old, some from decades, even centuries ago, yet everything seemed frozen in time. It was like the village had simply stopped existing, leaving nothing but a ghostly stillness. Then we saw her. A girl, maybe 10 or 11, standing barefoot in the middle of the street. She wore an old-fashioned white dress, her hair tangled and unkempt. She didn't move or speak, just stared at us with vacant eyes. Her face was unnaturally pale, as if it had never seen sunlight. One of my friends, Tom, called out to her, but she didn't respond. She simply turned and walked slowly down a side alley, disappearing behind one of the dark houses. Against every instinct, we decided to follow her, thinking maybe she could help us find a way out of the village. As we turned the corner, we found ourselves in a small, overgrown cemetery. The headstones were cracked and weathered, and each one bore a single name, followed by a date. Strangely, every headstone had the same date engraved on it, October 17th. But the most unsettling thing was the last headstone we saw. The name on it was Tom's, my friend who just called out to the girl. The date was that very night that we all froze. Tom laughed nervously, but his face had gone pale. This must be a prank," he muttered, though his voice trembled. But there was no one else around. Just us, the empty houses, and the silent girl. Suddenly, we heard footsteps. Not behind us, but all around us, echoing from every direction. It was as if invisible people were gathering, surrounding us. Shadows began to appear near the houses, figures in the mist, moving slowly closer. I could see faint outlines, their heads turned toward us. They walked stiffly, almost mechanically, eyes blank and unseen. Without a word, we ran. But no matter which direction we turned, the village seemed to twist and shift around us. Every street we took led us back to that small cemetery, back to the headstone with Tom's name on it. As we were trying to find our way out, I noticed the signs by the houses again, and I realized something that made my blood turn to ice. The names on each sign, one by one, they matched the names of my friends. And below each name, the dates had changed. They now bore today's date. Panic took over. We bolted toward the village entrance, not daring to look back. But as we reached what we thought was the edge of the village, the fog lifted, and we found ourselves standing right in the center of Willowbrook once again. It was as if the village itself wouldn't let us leave. And then we saw her again, the girl in the white dress. Only now, she wasn't alone. Around her stood several others, each dressed in the same outdated clothing, their eyes empty and cold. They stood in silence, staring, and as they looked at us, they began to whisper, soft murmurs that filled the air with words I couldn't understand. But one word echoed, clear as day, stay. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadows around us grew darker, closing in until there was no way out. I remember seeing my friends' faces, wide-eyed with terror, and then, nothing that I woke up hours later, alone, at the edge of a desolate road. My friends were gone, and so was any trace of the village. No signs, no buildings, just an empty stretch of forest and fog. Every so often, I dream of that girl in the white dress. In my dreams, she's always watching, whispering my name in that same, soft voice. I know now that the village never really let me go. And I fear that one day, it will call me back. Since that night, my life has never been the same. No matter how I try, the feeling of being watched clings to me, an invisible weight on my shoulders. I know now that the village, the shadows, the eerie whispers, has left its mark on me, like a curse. Whenever I lie in bed at night, I can almost hear that soft, chilling whisper in my ears, a murmur that I can't quite make out, stay, stay. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But as time passed, strange things began happening in my apartment. Every night, I'd lock my door before bed, but every morning, I'd find it slightly ajar, as if someone, or something, had slipped in during the night. Once, I noticed muddy footprints leading from the door to my bed and then disappearing, as though they'd vanished into thin air. And the smell, that same rotting, damp smell of the village would linger in the air, heavy and unmistakable. One night, I woke up from a nightmare, my heart pounding. I reached for the light, and in the corner of my eye, I saw her, a small figure standing outside my window, her long hair matted, her white dress stained and torn. She stared at me with those hollow eyes, the same as they'd been in the village. I froze, too terrified to move, and in that instant, she vanished. The next morning, I found wet footprints on the ground outside my window. That's when I realized, Willowbrook's curse had never left me. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the village followed. That girl, those shadows, they would always find me. Desperate, I moved from place to place, hoping to escape. But each night, I'd see her shadow outside my window, and the whispers would return to haunt my dreams. One day, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was an old, yellowed piece of paper with a single line written on it. Willowbrook is waiting for you. In that moment, I understood. I would never truly escape. The only way to break free was to return, to confront the curse head. So, I packed a bag and retraced my path, driving toward the spot where I'd once seen that worn, wooden sign. As night fell, the fog thickened, swirling around me. Just as I was ready to give up, the sign appeared in my headlights, Willowbrook Village. I stepped out of the car, took a deep breath, and walked into the village. It was exactly as I remembered, eerily silent, frozen in time. The houses stood like decayed skeletons, their dark windows like empty eye sockets, watching me. I made my way to the small cemetery in the village center, illuminated only by the pale moonlight. As I approached, my heart sank. There, freshly carved in stone, was a gravestone with my name on it, the date of death marked as tonight. A shiver ran down my spine, but somehow, I felt a strange sense of calm. I knew what I had to do. A slow, shuffling sound began to echo from all directions. Out of the darkness, the shadowy figures emerged, moving toward me. Standing at their center was the girl in the white dress. Her face held an unnatural smile, her vacant eyes piercing through me as though she could see into my very soul. She walked toward me, stopping just a few feet away. Her lips parted, and in a soft, chilling voice, she whispered, "Welcome home." In that moment, everything around me plunged into darkness. An icy coldness enveloped me, pulling me into a void, and then, nothing. They say Willowbrook Village is nothing but a ghost story. Supposedly, there's no evidence it ever existed. Anyone who's tried to visit it, whether by accident or on purpose, has never been seen again. But locals whisper of strange sightings each year on October 17th. Some claim to see a figure in the cemetery at the center of a forgotten village, standing beside a gravestone with their name on it, and some say there's a girl in a white dress, smiling faintly, waiting in silence for the next lost soul to join her.